Hello everybody and welcome to this week's reflection in the Cathedral of the Great Yarriambiack Creek. Welcome back to this place. I don't know if you can hear the sound of the frogs, the dunk 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 that we've become familiar to hearing with a bit more water in the creek. It's fantastic. I hope that you're well, that you're coping with whatever restrictions you're under. Certainly in Victoria, we're looking forward to a lifting of a few more restrictions this weekend, hopefully, but who knows. In this week's Gospel reading, politics and religion come together. It's fantastic. I don't know what you think, but I just think we're missing out by, in our culture, separating politics and religion. They I reckon, just go together too often, and it makes for a good conflict story, it gets a bit of energy in the room, as it were. We've got two little stories today in our gospel reading for this weekend. And the first, the Pharisees come to Jesus with a trick question. And we know that trick questions have been around forever, do you know? And I think there's a fact that Jesus was asked 183 questions in the Gospels, and he only ever answered 3 of them. Normally he'd ask a question back, which is part of the point of the Gospel reading this week. And the next one is about divorce. Anyway, the Romans had come in to the land of Israel, and they then asked the Jewish people to pay a tax for the land that was no longer theirs. You can imagine that if someone's taken over your land and then they ask for a tax from you, that would be pretty annoying. But this is what the basis of the story is, because on the Denarius was Caesar's inscription, or it's the head of Caesar's head, and also the inscription apparently read, Son of God, the High Priest. Well, you can imagine that in that Jewish culture, that was just not kosher at all. The Pharisees ask him, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? If Jesus supports the payment, he loses kudos with the people. But if he rejects the payment, then he also starts to kindle the fire of revolution and revolt and the disturbance of good order. Historically, some Jews had started a revolution, and they all ended up on crosses everywhere. And you can imagine that there's a few places in our current world where potentially that could also happen. So Jesus asks them a question in return. Show me a denarius. Well, of course, what happens is they offer him the denarius from their own pockets. And so his question turns the whole thing on its head, in that they are carrying the coin of the system that they abhor. They're in a slightly tricky situation. The question about divorce as well is trying to trick Jesus into, what part of the law do you agree with or not? And Matthew's Gospel basically helps to explain that the kingdom of God, the attitude that Jesus is bringing to this debate about politics and religion on earth, is all about life, not death. Jesus is talking about a God of the living, not a God of the dead. And if you have to pay taxes to the local authorities, then pay them. However, you also need to offer back to God what is God's. What does this mean for you and for me? As you know, one of my favourite topics is this notion of a life with God is to transform us, is to heal us, is to liberate us. And in this gospel, it's the same. We are to be liberated. We are to forge a new identity with the God who confronts power, who confronts change, who confronts that which is unjust, not through force, battles, constant arguments, but through death and resurrection. I think COVID has really challenged us as a society, and certainly as a church, for sure. And I think it's going to be blamed for many things over the next few years. But COVID has given us an opportunity to really reimagine what our identity is like in the face of a changing society. What are the good things that we keep and nurture and honour? And how can we act differently as part of our response to need within the community or need within our own lives? So my question for you this week is, it's not very clear really. But maybe it's about reflecting where is God, or where has COVID invited you to start a process of change? It doesn't have to be radical. It might be very simply responding differently to a circumstance or a situation. Developing a relationship with a neighbour or a friend with a bit more intimacy. Or maybe even working out, what do I need to give back to the divine, whoever that might be for me. Is it gratitude? Is it service? Is it trying to understand God or the divine in our lives a little bit more? I think these are actually quite serious questions and should not be, shouldn't kind of just flip over them. So I recognise that this task this week, potentially, should you choose to accept it, is not the easiest one. But hopefully it brings life to you and to those around you. And we'll see you next week.